Hiya, and welcome back to Geology James. It's been a while. I've made no secret on LinkedIn and some of my earlier videos on this channel as well that I've been challenged with my mental health from really from 2018 onwards, and unfortunately 2022 was no different. But we're coming up to the engineering group of the Geological annual conference in Cambridge, and I'll be presenting this year. And I also presented last year, and when I did, I said within a week I'd get a video up, and when I said a week, what I actually meant, of course, was within a year. So this video is a presentation that I gave last year on Boston Barrier. Hope you enjoy it. It's recorded from halfway up the lecture theatre, so it's not the easiest to follow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do the lecture as I recorded it now, and then I'll pop back and say hi, and then I'll put on the slides as actual slides, so they're a bit easier to read for anyone that's still got any interest left at the end of listening to me talk for 15 odd minutes. So I'll see you in those 15 odd minutes. Hope you enjoy it.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks for inviting me to speak. It's a privilege, as everyone said. So I'm going to be talking to you about tidal barrier in Boston. Unfortunately, it isn't that Boston. It's Boston in Lincolnshire, and we've had a lot of talk, particularly since lunch, about uncertainty. There is absolutely no certainty that that's a flood. That was December 2013, when there was a tidal surge. Tidal surges are when you get a storm front that passes across the country. You get an area of low pressure, and that area of low pressure goes over the North Sea. The low pressure essentially sucks the water up a little bit so that the tides are a little bit higher, and then the winds that drive round funnel the North Sea down into the Wash. And as far as Boston's concerned, the Haven, which is the river, has a surge of water that comes off it. So you end up with tides, with floods that are abnormally high. And as sea levels rise, it just follows that risk is going to increase. So on the likelihood portion of the risk matrix, the likelihood of these reoccurring goes up. Now, I'm lucky I've never been involved, I don't know if anybody has, but there are a few things as traumatic as a flood for the people that are affected by them. Obviously there's all the stuff that you have to throw away, but there's the silt, the contamination, the smell, the bacteria that comes in with the water. It really is a soul-destroying event. And there are families in Boston, 50 streets flooded, 800 homes and businesses. Boston is right at the top of the UK's deprivation index, which means that half the people in the town haven't got insurance. So they've not been able to recover from the damage that occurred. So they're still living in temporary accommodation months or even years later. So a really, really tragic affair. We heard from Jasper about the village in Laos, I think it was, at the top of the hill, or Vietnam, where nobody could make a business case for upgrading the road. The same isn't true at Boston. The project cost, the construction is going to be about 110 million, the project costs about 125 million, but the economic benefits are 10 times that. So as far as making a business case, it's an absolute shoo-in. But there will be many, many settlements on the coast, close to rivers, where somebody has got to make a decision. Is it beneficial? Is there a cost benefit to protect it, or do we have to abandon it? There's a whole conference in the minefield of what happens when you start talking about abandonment and moving people on. 800 businesses will be protected by the Boston Barrier, 14,000 homes protected, and 226 listed buildings, of which the stump, which is 500 years old, you can see almost all of Lincolnshire from the top of it, will be one of the things that's protected. In the floods of 2013, the damage to the stump alone was £1 million. So that's a bit of context. We're going to have some engineering and some geology in this talk. So first of all, the engineering. This is the barrier. The footprint of the structure is 25 metres by 25 metres, which is about the size of this lecture theatre, actually, I said. It was built inside a cofferdam. The gate, which came by sea from Holland, the steel is 362 tonnes, but then you nearly double that by pumping water into it to give you a 700-tonne gate. The recess that it sits in will fill with silt, so the rams need to be able to push that 700 tonnes potentially through silt to get the gate to close. So the rams are 55 tonnes, and I think from memory there's 12,000 litres of hydraulic oil required to drive them. So that's just the barrier. That isn't the whole scheme. The whole scheme is about a mile of sheet pile wall along the right bank, tying into the existing flood defence, up through the tidal barrier. There's a barrier control building, then piling all along the left bank, which is within the estate of the Port of Boston. There's a smaller but similar gate structure to go into the entrance to the wet dock, and then tying into the sluice that's on the Morfrost drain. There's a cheaper solution which doesn't defend the wet dock, but then you lose a lot of the economic benefit. So the cost ratio, the cost benefit was clear. You defend the port to give Boston an economic future. And I have another 15-minute talk on UN SDGs in Boston. SDGs don't just apply to the developing world. The sustainable benefits for the community of Boston brought about by this flood defence map against all 17 of the SDGs, and there's a really nice publication in the ICE special publication on climate change that goes through the background to that. I would have loved to have talked more, but time is against us. We talked a lot about geological models. I'm going to come back to geological models in a little while. The geology isn't that complex. We've got glacial tilted depth, we've got tidal flat deposits, silts, clays and peats in the green, and then on the left bank in particular, lots of grey made ground. And I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the barrier and the glacial tilt, and I'm going to talk about the left bank in Port of Boston and Anthropocene engineering geology. So risk number one was the cofferdam. We did quantitative risk assessment on the programme, and anything that caused damage to the cofferdam blew the programme. It smashed the project. So that was risk number one. What we're looking at here is sort of apples with apples photographs from the Ipswich barrier on the right and the Boston barrier on the left. And we took a decision that we wanted a construction approach that didn't need all that shuttering in the cofferdam, because we thought that led to a degree of complexity that we wanted to try to avoid. So the shuttering there is actually tied to I-beams at 8 sections inside of the cofferdam. In a little bit more detail, there's a 25-metre square cofferdam in the centre. You can see the H-piles, the I-beams that we tie the shuttering to give stiffness to the two lateral sides, and then we built upstream and downstream cells, almost exclusively because otherwise we would have needed the largest crane in Europe just to lift rebar into the structure. We were so constrained on space. But also that gave us a lot of protection against boat impact as well. And it allowed us, again, there's another talk just on the arrival of the gate. We drove the gate on over those landing platforms. It's proper Discovery Channel stuff. To get a feel for the scale then, there's the jack-up that was required to do the piling. You can see the central cofferdam. And that photo, I think, really does help you appreciate this statement that the cofferdam was project risk number one. No other reason to show you this, and it's a cool photo. That's the jack up going through the bypass channel with half a metre to spare on either side. And you can imagine the nervousness about that just tapping those piles on the side of the cofferdam. So some geology. The foundation of the barrier is on glacial till. It was a fairly routine piece of engineering to look at bearing capacity and settlement. Everything was going to be fine. But we were worried that we'd got some permeability data that was variable. And we were worried about sand pockets, lenses within the till that might have meant that instead of having a lovely seal, as we've got there, we might have had seepage coming in. And then a little more subtly, this cofferdam, before the base core and side walls were in, was going to be open for about 6 months. And we were worried about the essentially softening of the glacial till, going from an undrained condition to a drained condition and blowing the base of the foundation, worst case while the concrete either wasn't in or while the concrete was green. And so we had a really big consultation, brightest minds from Mott MacDonald, brightest minds from Van Nuttall, the contractor, and we couldn't agree on how we were going to do this. So we got the brightest mind in this field, Martin Preen, to come and sort of adjudicate for us. And the conclusion was we had to put some passive wells in. So that's a really nice example of understanding the geology. If you know what you're looking for, you know what to be prepared for. And we put the passive wells in to give ourselves the comfort that the base of the cofferdam wasn't going to blow during construction. The other element of engineering geology is Anthropocene troubles, man-made problems. I'm going to look at the Port of Boston. This is a photograph from 1930. You can see the port, and this is over here, this is the Riverside Quays. Not developed at this stage, other than there's a slipway that we assume has got some rails on it for getting boats in and out. And then a second photo from about 1935, I think this is. We can see now all of the left bank has got a concrete sheet pile wall. They're all anchored, anchor ties going back. You can see there's a railway line coming along the front of the quayside. There's a grain silo building, and if we had longer, I'd walk you through the 6 or 7 slides we've got from the desk study of the generations of mess that were in there. Now, the brave bit. That hasn't worked. That has. Excellent. So, we've talked a lot about trying to influence early in the project, and there's a tremendous amount that we did in the left bank that I'm going to show you now that could have been done earlier to tell the story, to convince people of the problems, and have got better engineering solutions in place before the job went to design and build, and that would have been good for the client. That didn't happen. We got to do this work I'm going to show you now after that, when there was money for us to do it in the D&B package. But this is the BIM model of the project, and we're just going to zoom in on this area here, and if I take the model, so put the model down, I'm going to just drop this down. No. There we go. You can see this is the anchor beam for that concrete sheet pile wall I showed you. The original scheme was the tender scheme, reference design, was a sheet pile wall with a row of anchor sheet piles that, as it turned out, would have been right on top of that. And so we were left with all kinds of trouble. And what we ended up doing was these tube sheet piles as isolated deadman anchors to anchor the retaining wall. But as we go along, you can see that the anchor beam stops, and there's a piled trestle table there. So again, we needed a different solution. And what we ended up having to do there was, this is a view from the other side, we had to put inclined ground anchors in. There's the trestle table. There's the piles from an existing crane pad that are in the ground, and the only solution was to almost double the unit cost for the anchored sheet pile walling, was to put these ground anchors in. But with this model, we were able to demonstrate that to the client, and they were able to accept that that was the only viable solution. Almost all of the stuff that's in this model could have been done before the D&B tender. And so I think that's the key message that I want to get across is let's have the confidence, the courage of our convictions. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're unlikely to find much of value. We know what we're looking for. We need to get these stories, tell these stories early to convince people, to get the money. You know, to do this test study would have been 50 grand and a £100 million scheme. The business case is clear. So let's have the courage of our convictions and do that. 2 minutes, lovely. I've got about 2 slides left. Yeah, that's fine. There you go. Just some photographs then of, this is the piling on that left bank. You can see the vibratory hammer putting the sheet piles in. There's a drop hammer sat on the piles, and we also had a super heavy drop hammer for hard driving. I made a mistake with Claire Smith of doing an article on the phone, and I said, "Oh, we just tap them in with a heavy hammer," and she quoted me verbatim. So don't try and be funny with Claire. And these are, this is actually the piles for a crane pad. I've not gone on to the crane pads, but just to give you a feel for the type of piling that we were doing in those ground with those buried obstructions. We understand the Anthropocene, we understand how to build a story and tell a story. Let's tell stories. Thank you.
Well, there you go. That was the talk, and like I said, what I'm going to do now is just put the slides into the video, so that if you want to see in a bit more detail some of the things that I was talking about, then you'll have to see that as well. So these are the slides that accompanied the presentation that I've just given, just so that if you're watching on YouTube, you can see them a bit more closely. That's a lovely picture of the barrier in defence position, holding back the first tidal surge of its life. This is a slide that got a giggle at the start of the presentation. Boston in Lincolnshire. And this is the horrible view of Boston when it flooded in 2013. You can see the horrible impact it has on all those houses and businesses, as well as the port of Boston, which is completely inundated. I'll read this slide out loud. This is taken from a publication that Mark MacDonald made about the work that we did with the Environment Agency and our JV partners, BAM Nuttall. So the night the floods came, few things in life can be more distressing than to see your home flooded and furniture and belongings destroyed. Just ask the residents of Boston. On the night of the 5th of December 2013, the Lincolnshire market town was inundated by a tidal surge that overtopped defences along the Haven, the tidal river that connects the town's port to the sea. More than 50 streets were flooded, causing widespread damage to 800 homes and businesses. Hundreds of people were forced to leave their homes. A few households became trapped by the floodwaters and had to be taken to safety by rescue teams with inflatable boats. It would take months for the community to fully recover. Only half of the residents whose properties were flooded were covered by insurance. A year later, some of them were still living in temporary accommodation. Boston, which lies entirely within a floodplain, has a long history of tidal flooding. Previous flood events in 1953 and 1978 had highlighted the need for improved defences against tidal surges. A tidal barrier was identified as the best solution, not just to reduce the risk of tidal flooding, but to enable opportunities for regenerating the town and its waterways. After the floods of 2013, the construction of a tidal barrier was given national priority status by the Environment Agency. BMNJV, a joint venture company formed by Mott MacDonald and BAM Nuttall, was awarded the contract to deliver this critical piece of infrastructure. For both the scheme's outline and detailed design, Mott MacDonald's engineers and specialists provided project management and civil, structural, geotechnical and mechanical design services. So protecting Boston against climate change. Construction work started in January 2018 and the gate was installed in December 2019. Progress was slowed but not stopped by the COVID-19 pandemic. Given Category A status by the Environment Agency, the project was allowed to continue, albeit subject to restrictions. Social distancing and working bubbles were observed by the workforce on site. Visitors were not allowed and the whole of the design team worked remotely from home. The Boston Barrier became fully operational in December 2020. When the whole scheme is completed, there will be new flood defence walls on both banks and new vertical sector gates, 18 metres wide and 11 metres high, across the entrance to the port of Boston's wet dock. These gates will better protect the port's facilities as well as homes and businesses downstream of the barrier. All this infrastructure will provide the town with protection against a 1 in 300 year flood event, accounting for future sea level rise and the likely increased frequency of tidal surges as a result of climate change. It would have prevented the flooding of December 2013. When all works are completed in 2023, more than 14,000 homes and 800 businesses will be protected, including 226 listed buildings, the most famous of which is the Boston Stump, the medieval St. Botolph's Church with its iconic tower, a landmark for over 500 years. The 2013 flooding caused almost £1 million worth of damage to the building. And so there's some of the big numbers that show just how beneficial and what a shoe-in for funding the project really was. £110 million construction cost, £1.16 billion in economic benefits, 800 businesses, 14,000 homes protected, and preventing having to do £1 million worth of work on St. Botolph's Church every time Boston floods. Here's some pictures of the gate during construction, just to give you some numbers. 55-ton hydraulic ram, post-tensioned anchorages into the big concrete block, the precast curved recess to house the gate, which is quite difficult to construct upside down. Gravity doesn't like that arrangement when you pour in concrete. The rising sector gate, which is primarily 362 tonnes, but when ballasted with water is 700 tonnes. Still in basin downstream to dissipate energy, and a nap vent to prevent vibration of the gate when the gate is in this position, which allows it to impound a bit of water upstream and allow further impregation into the South 40-foot drain. Here's the map then of the scheme with the flood defence in the red dashed line, the barrier in the yellow box, and the vertical sector gates at the entrance of the wet dock in the blue box. Downstream of these works, the flood defences are already higher or will be raised as part of separate schemes. There's the geological model, showing, as I mentioned, relatively straightforward in the geological timescale, alluvium over glacial till, but with the ground in the port of Boston and the flood defence providing the primary areas of interest from an engineering geological perspective and a site investigation perspective. Project risk number 1 was the barrier, and these are the photos that I showed in the presentation. At the same stage of construction at Ipswich on the right and Boston on the left, and this was a result of our twin wall coffer dam arrangement that we chose to adopt at Boston. And there you can see a BIM model of what it actually looks like. The aerial photograph. And there is the jack-up going through the bypass channel. That's the glacial till at the bottom of the excavation when we got down there, and you can see that's a nice tight seal. A lot of leakage in through the base, although a little bit coming in through the sheets. Here's the aerial shot of the port before the left bank wall was constructed in 1938. And now, with the left bank quay wall in place and the railways all significantly advanced within the port. Here's our flood defence wall. In the distance is the left bank with the vibratory hammer and the impact hammer on the piles, and in the foreground the sheet piles on the right bank of the river. These are the tube piles that went underneath one of the crane pads and were actually used as well to anchor the sheet pile wall to the crane pad. Here's a summing up slide then. So Boston Barrier is a climate resilient scheme. It protects 14,000 properties from 100 years of climate change with a huge economic benefit compared to project cost. The cofferdam was project risk number 1 and took a deep understanding of the glacial till to manage a temporary base stability, and the riverside quay walls were fraught with Anthropocene risks of utilities and buried obstructions. And this was the message that I tried to get across at the end to the group, which is, as geologists, we need to have confidence that we know what we're looking for. We can imagine what the underground looks like, and we need to use that confidence to convince clients to invest more in doing as much as possible as early as possible. So that feasibility stage ground model right at the start, a relatively modest investment in experience, expertise and research can really pay huge dividends downstream. It's not a new message, but it is probably more important now than ever. Well, I hope they were illuminating, and I hope you've enjoyed this first video of 2023. And just as I promised before, I will get up a video of my 2023 presentation at the EGGS conference, hopefully sometime middle to end of next week. Cheers.